Thanks, Byron. It's my great pleasure and honor to introduce my friend and colleague, Ken Pargament, whom I've known probably for about 25 years. Ken has been studying the instrumental function of faith and spirituality for human psychology since the 1970s, and his work actually predates the work of all of us who've built our reputations on studying the impact of religion on health. Ken was there before any of us doing original research on religion, and I consider him kind of, for you psychologists out there, kind of a modern day successor to William James and all the other pioneers in the psychology of religion. Dr. Pargament is professor of clinical psychology at Bowling Green State University. He received his PhD in clinical psych from Maryland and interned in clinical psych at Rutgers. He completed a 2-year postdoc in psychiatric epi at Johns Hopkins. He's mentored over 50 doctoral students at Bowling Green over the past 35 years. He's also a distinguished scholar at the Institute for Spirituality and Health at Texas Medical Center in Houston. As a clinical psychologist, he's long advocated greater sensitivity to spirituality in healthcare, and he's designed and tested spiritually integrated treatments for all kinds of things: survivors of child sexual abuse, women infected with HIV, patients with heart disease, cancer, so on. And this work culminated in his 2007 book, Spiritually Integrated Psychotherapy. Dr. Pargament is also editor-in-chief of the brand new 2-volume APA, American Psychological Association, Handbook of Psychology, Religion, and Spirituality. I think just out last month, maybe. This book highlights the central role of spirituality in health and human behavior. In 2009, Dr. Pargament won the Oscar Pfister Award from the American Psychiatric Association. This is a career award for religion and psychiatry and mental health. And previous winners of the Pfister Award included Viktor Frankl, Hans Kung, and Don Browning, among others. He's also won the National Samaritan Center Award for contributions to human health and growth. And finally, Dr. Pargament has done tons of consulting over the years for the NIH, the World Health Organization, the U.S. Army, and his research has garnered national and international media attention. I was just thinking last night, I was putting these remarks together, in the past, I think 2 years, past couple of years, I introduced Ken to give the 10th annual Larson Lecture at Duke University School of Medicine, and then he introduced me to give the annual Fellers Lecture at Texas Medical Center in Houston. And now I'm introducing him to give the first annual Stark Lecture at Baylor, so we're playing some sort of name lecture tag, and it means you're up. You've got to come up with something for me next year. But in the meantime, we're really thrilled to have Ken here to Baylor, and I look forward to hearing his remarks on sacred matters, implications of spirituality for health and well-being. All yours, Ken.
Well, thank you, Jeff, for that very nice introduction, and I'm really delighted and honored and not a little bit humbled to be here to be able to give this lecture in honor of Rodney Stark. Dr. Stark has been one of my early heroes and continues to be a hero of mine in the field. I think the first paper I read of his was a paper on the taxonomy of religious experience, and I think he wrote that in 1965 or so. But it was so rich and appreciative of the diversity of religious experience, and I particularly liked the fact that he included not only divine religious experience, but diabolic religious experience, which really, way before its time, he showed this tremendous appreciation for balance and both the potentially constructive and destructive sides of religious life. Later, his work in Christian beliefs and anti-Semitism was, I think, a remarkably important and provocative research, investigation, and book. And he's continued to take on tough issues, as you know, over the course of his career, and take tough stands. He doesn't suffer fools gladly. I came across this interview he had given to a media person, and I just wanted to read this little segment to you here that I thought was very interesting. He was asked by someone in the media, You've expressed frustration in the past with how the media report on religion in America. Are the American media failing to understand everyday religious Americans? That's the question. His response: there's something going on in the media right now that I wish I could somehow penetrate the fog. There's a woman who has a book called Angels in My Hair. It's a bestseller. People are running around getting idiot psychologists to say that there are illusions here. And they find other so-called expert psychologists who say that some people have a sensitivity to the spirit world. When I read that, I thought, did anybody ever call me about angels in my hair? And was I asked to comment on it? Hopefully I wasn't, and I wasn't one of those idiot psychologists that Rodney Stark was speaking to. Anyway, what I'd like to talk about today is sacred matters. And I'd just like to comment by noting that things have changed. Jeff's heard this story before from me, but I will repeat it. My very first colloquium was 1977 to a psychology department. And I was talking about religion and mental health, and I thought it went pretty well. Afterwards, the chairman of the department comes up to the podium, leans over, and whispers to me, "I'm Catholic." Now, fortunately, trained as a psychologist, we're prepared to deal with everything, so nothing can throw us for a loop. So I gave the universal psychological response. I whispered, "Oh." Anyone can do it. Worked really well. Then I whispered, "Why are we whispering?" And he says, "Well, you know, religion, psychology, health, we don't put those things together. We don't talk about those things here." I think that was a very accurate reflection of the times. People whispered. Things have changed in the last 20 years in particular. Things have changed quite a bit, and I'm delighted to be around to see the change, that people are talking directly about religion, spirituality, and health, and showing that it in fact makes a difference. Lots of research now. Look at just the changes in the numbers. You can see from the 60s to the last decade, dramatic increase in numbers of studies of religion. The increase in numbers of studies of spirituality has been even more remarkable. It's been huge over the last 40, 50 years. And it's pretty clear from these findings that religion and spirituality are solid, sometimes robust predictors of health and well-being, robust predictors of alcohol abuse, drug abuse, promiscuity, lower rates of crime, and much of that work has been done by Byron Johnson here at Baylor. Other studies show that frequent church attendance is consistently and robustly related to longer life. This is a study done by David Hummer, published in, let's see, which journal was it? Well, I'm forgetting the name of the journal, but, and he found that frequent church attendance was tied to a 7-year increase in life expectancy on average. 7-year increase. I was published in Demographics, that's what it was. For African Americans, the effect is doubled. Frequent church attendance, attending church once a week or more, tied to 14-year increase in life expectancy. And this finding's been replicated in numerous studies now, so it's not a kind of a fluky finding. But spirituality and religion also have a darker side. And one study that I did with Harold Koenig at Duke University, we followed up patients with physical illness, elderly, and tracked their health status over the following 2 years and found that of our sample of 600, about 175, 176 died. And we took a look at predictors, religious predictors of mortality. And in fact, what we found was that patients who appeared to be struggling with matters of faith, as indicated by items such as wonder whether God had abandoned me, patients who reported that questions about whether they're being abandoned by God at baseline were more likely to die over the next 2 years. Patients who wondered whether God loved them were more likely to die over the next 2 years. Patients who felt their illness may be the work of the devil were more likely to die over the next 2 years. This is the first study that I'm aware of that identified a religious risk factor for mortality. We know there are some religious factors for mortality that reduce the risk of mortality. This increases the risk of mortality, which I believe is an important take-home point in this, that religion can be a double-edged sword. It can enhance life and health and well-being, but certain forms of religious expression may in fact be destructive and interfere with health and well-being. Well, we've now moved beyond the question of whether religion affects health and well-being to, I think, a more focused, specific, and maybe challenging question, which is, why may religion affect health and well-being? Why? It's not a new question. Social scientists have been grappling with this question for many years. And as with most questions in the social sciences, we can't agree on an answer. Traditionally, social scientists have tried to explain religion in terms of presumably more basic motives. So Freud, for instance, Freud talked about religion largely as a means of reducing anxiety and our own wayward impulses. So he believed that a psychic transformation takes place in the child to allay his or her deepest fears and to turn the overwhelming forces of nature into something more malleable, as you can hear in this quote. So religion for Freud was a form of anxiety reduction and impulse control. Durkheim saw religion largely as a means of fostering social solidarity and community. And you see here he wrote that if religion has given birth to all that's essential into society, it's because the idea of society is the soul of religion. Another explanation for religious involvement. Religion builds community, connectedness. Another explanation, anthropologist Clifford Geertz. This was fun putting together because I'd never seen a picture of Clifford Geertz before. He didn't look like the way I thought he would look. But there's Clifford Geertz for you. He saw religion largely as a way of making meaning of the seemingly incomprehensible. And this is one of my favorite quotes in the whole field. He said, "The religious impulse is not to deny the undeniable, that there are unexplainable events, that life hurts, or that rain falls upon the unjust, but to deny that there are inexplicable events, that life is unendurable, and that justice is a mirage." Life has meaning. That's what religion is about, finding that meaning. That's the explanation. More recently, we see a lot of emphasis on physiological and evolutionary explanations for religion and spirituality. And this is not anyone famous. It was an evolutionary biologist. I'd given a talk at a university about religion, and he thought it was a good talk, but it was basically, it was one of these responses, well, really good talk, but let me tell you something, and this is what he said. "I know this religious stuff is important, but aren't we just talking about a bunch of hormones here?" That's an explanation, that when you come right down to it, religious spiritual involvement is just about hormonal functioning, or just about genetics, or just about evolutionary advantage. Those are other explanations. I think because psychologists, sociologists, anthropologists, as a group, are far less religious than the general population. And there's good data that we, as a group, are abnormal. Social scientists are abnormal. And I mean that purely in the statistical sense. Well, maybe not purely, but at least partly in the statistical sense, social scientists are abnormal. Maybe because we ourselves tend to be less religious, less theistic, we're more likely to see God as illusory, which means to explain religion and spirituality, we have to turn to other explanations. It can't be something about the heart and soul of spirituality itself. It's got to be something else. It's got to be something psychological, something social, something physiological. Well, I wouldn't argue with any of these explanations. I think each of them offers some important insight into human behavior and religion and spirituality. And there's good data to support each of these explanations in part. What I want to suggest today is that these explanations are incomplete. They're incomplete. They're insufficient. That part of the explanation for why religion relates to health and well-being has to do with something else. There's something missing. What's missing? All right, well, I'm going to lead you into it. First of all, let me note that to appreciate where I'm going to go with this, I want you to kind of get this little background here. Another kind of tendency in the social sciences is to see human behavior in terms of reactive forces. We have another number of explanations for how we come to be who we are. One explanation has to do with childhood experience. Freud was a big fan of personality being shaped by early childhood experience. And in fact, there's good evidence that childhood experience does shape behavior in many ways. Genetics and physiology. We have good evidence that genetics and physiology can shape behavior in our lives in many, many ways. The environment. Good evidence that environmental factors shape behavior in many ways. But let me suggest again that this picture of human nature as being shaped by external or internal forces is in fact incomplete. Something's missing. And no less than Steven Pinker, who was no huge fan of free will, had this to say. He called it the Harvard Law of Animal Behavior, which he wrote tongue-in-cheek. He said, under controlled experimental conditions of temperature, time, lighting, feeding, and training, the organism will behave as it damned well pleases. It's actually a very important point, because when you throw almost all of the predictive factors into an equation, we still have most of human behavior unexplained. Most of human behavior is unexplained. Now, social scientists, statisticians may talk about that as error variance. Another explanation is maybe there's something about free will, about organisms just choosing to confound the social scientists' rules by doing what they damn well please. Have you ever done what you damn well please in spite of good reason and rationality? How many haven't? Okay, you see what I mean? I certainly have. Okay. What's missing from this view of human nature? What's missing is, I think, in some ways, one of the best predictors of human behavior, and it has nothing to do with childhood experience, has nothing to do with your past learning, has nothing to do with genetics and physiology. I can make, for instance, some really powerful predictions, a very accurate prediction about what you're going to be doing tonight at 10 p.m. And I know some of you, but not many of you. And I don't know anything about your childhood experiences, your environment, or your genetics. How can I predict what you're going to do tonight at 10 p.m.? All I have to do is ask one question. You know what that question is? And I can be a really accurate predictor of behavior by asking one question. What's the question? Any ideas? Okay, here's the amazing question. Tell me, what do you plan to be doing tonight at 10 p.m.? I'm good. But you could do it too. You could do it too. There's a really important point. The point is that our plans, our intentions, our goals, our dreams, our strivings are important predictors of human behavior. We're not just puppets or reactors to history, to our social environments, to our genetics. Our capacity to plan, envision, and move to a future is an important predictor of behavior. As a matter of fact, if I'm seeing a client who's suicidal, do you know what the most important question to ask is? Do you know what the most important question is? One question overrides every other question. It's not, have you ever tried in the past? It's not, has anyone in your family ever tried? It's not your diagnosis. The most important question to ask is, so tell me, when you leave here today, do you have a plan to kill yourself? And no matter what they've answered to any of the other questions, if someone will say, yeah, I plan to hurt myself when I leave here today. I plan to take an overdose. I plan to go in the garage and to sit in the car and turn on the engine. That's the most important thing to know, and that's what you take more seriously than anything, the intention. And intentions are powerful predictors of behaviors. Not a totally new idea. Viktor Frankl, psychiatrist Viktor Frankl, said that people who have a why to live can deal with almost any how. Having something to strive for, having an intention, having a future, having something of meaning in the future is critical for dealing with life and being able to make sense of pain and suffering and make the suffering sufferable. He has some very powerful examples of people who, because they could envision a future, were able to survive the camps. Maybe you can think of people in your own life, in your family or friends, who've also done remarkable things in dealing with pain, tragedy, and suffering because they could envision a future. They had something to strive for. I worked with a woman several years ago who had been diagnosed with a glioblastoma, a malignant brain tumor, and her physician had only given her 1 year to live, which is evidently one of the, I don't like it when physicians give people dates for how long you live because they're very unreliable. But anyway, she came in, she was upset about that, and I says, well, tell me, what do you have to live for? What would give you some purpose in your life? And she's Jewish. She said, well, my son's going to be bar mitzvahed in 3 years. I want to be there for his bar mitzvah. I said, sounds good. Let's take a look at what you need to do to try to make that happen. She became very focused on taking care of herself, getting the treatments that she needed. She had a goal, she had a vision, and she survived. Matter of fact, she survived almost till her son graduated high school. Remarkable for someone with that condition. On the other hand, people who don't have a vision, something to strive for, they're more likely to run into trouble. That loss of meaning is problematic. I came across this quote, this example of a New York cabbie who doesn't seem to have a lot of meaning in life. He says, we're here to live and die. I drive a cab, I do some fishing, I take my girl out, pay taxes, do a little reading, then get ready to drop dead. Life's a big fake, nobody gives a damn. You're rich or poor, you're here, you're gone. You get the gist of this. Not a whole lot to look forward to. I don't think I'd enjoy taking a cab ride with this guy. So Frankl's work, and what I'm talking about, underscores a different view of human nature having something to strive for. Now, we can strive for many things in life. Our strivings help define us as human beings. There are some measures of striving. If I tested your strivings, you'd see in this room, even though there's some similarities among us all, some real differences in our vision for the future, the things that we're striving for. They define us, and there are achievement strivings and psychological strivings, social, physical, material, and we can strive for destructive ends too, which is really important to note, that people can be every bit as planful in striving to do damage, as we saw in the Boston Marathon tragedy, with someone, whoever was doing it, was exceptionally planful and thoughtful and very actively striving to commit murder and mayhem. So we can be quite destructive in our strivings. There's nothing inherently good about strivings. It matters a lot what we strive for. Which leads to the point I want to make here. There's another kind of striving, spiritual strivings. We can strive for things in life that I might call sacred. What do I mean by sacred? I'm referring not only to God, higher powers, or the divine, but other aspects of life that can take on spiritual character by their association with or representation of the divine. And here's another way of thinking about it. You have a sacred core of divinity, however we may call that divinity. And then that sacred core can extend to other aspects of life that take on sacred qualities. Other aspects of life can take on sacred qualities by virtue of an association with the sacred core. So what can do that? Well, I'd like to give the example of a trip I took with my 12-year-old son to the Grand Canyon. I'd never been out to the Grand Canyon. How many of you have been to the Grand Canyon? Okay. So here I am driving up, and it's a flat, high plain with a lot of pine trees, and you pull into a parking lot, and you don't see anything. It's just flat. It could be Ohio, where I'm from. So my son and I are walking up we crossed the parking lot, and then the Grand Canyon is right there. And when I saw it, it was like the world dropped away beneath my feet. And it was the most amazing sight that I've ever seen. And all the sacred qualities were part of that experience, transcendence. There was something wholly other about the Grand Canyon. And Rudolf Otto, theologian, talked about that. He said, there's an otherness to religious experience. It's beyond the sphere of the usual, the intelligible, the familiar. It falls outside the limits of the canny. Those of you women who've had a baby, I suspect for some of you it was a transcendent experience. For some of you, you might call it something else, but some of you might experience as transcendent. Another sacred quality, the Grand Canyon, is boundless. It seems to go on forever. With sacred quality of boundlessness, we're talking about something of infinite time and infinite space. So William Blake talked about it, of the boundlessness in a grain of sand. Plato talked about the boundlessness of beauty. It's eternal. It neither waxes nor wanes. I like David Elkins, a more modern psychologist, said, eternity breaks in, limitedness falls away. We find ourselves in an eternal present. That's the nature of boundlessness. That can be part of sacred experience. Sacred experiences, another sacred quality is ultimacy. The feeling that you're in touch with something that's really real, as Clifford Geertz said again. With ultimacy, you feel like you're in touch with something that's ultimately true. When I saw the Grand Canyon, I felt like I was in touch with something elemental, something very basic about the universe that I hadn't realized before. It was something true. And Paul Tillich talks about it. He says, ultimacy lies at the center of existence, and it refers to the essential and absolute ground of truth. We're talking about what's real here. I like that. Now, as a psychologist, we generally don't talk about what's really real, but we can certainly talk about the perception of things being really real. And those perceptions help define what makes things sacred. The way I'm talking about sacred here, the sacred is not out there. We have relationships with things sacred. It's a connection. It's a point of connectedness between us and whatever we may hold sacred. And virtually any aspect of life can take on sacred status. It can be the virtues. And here's a quote from one of our interviewees who talked about peace and joy and love and beauty and health, all of these virtues. She called it the whole cookie factory. She said God gives these resources to us like the sun gives light. So these virtues are not simply secular virtues. These virtues have power and spirituality because she sees God imbuing these virtues with sacred qualities. Cultural products can be sacred, even sports. And here we have a Brazilian talking about the gift that soccer represents to fans in Brazil. He says, soccer is our gift from God, our healing grace so that we Brazilians can go on. Roles can be sacred. Parenting can be sacred. Marriage can be sacred. Work can be sacred. I'll share, Jeff, I don't mean to embarrass you, but Jeff Levin shared with me the joy he has just coming to work Monday morning, how much he just loves being able to come to work Monday morning. For him, my bet would be, if we gave him our measure of sacred vocation, work is not just a job. Work is a whole orienting force in life. It's something that has a deeper value and meaning. And for many people here, I bet work is more than just a job. It's a vocation. It's something that has deep power and meaning. People can take on sacred qualities. This is a quote that one of my graduate students shared with me. She wrote this when she was 13. This was from her diary. She's an amazing writer. She said, at 13, she said, God has a deep, raspy voice. God is a jazz singer. She's plush, warm, and rosy. God is a grandmother. He has the patient rock of an old man. He hums and laughs. He marvels at the sky. God coos at babies. I love that. She's a new mother. He's the steady, gentle hand of a nurse, the cool reassurance of a person pursuing his life's work, the free spirit of a young man wandering only to live and love life. So when she sees people, she sees something divine. She imbues people with sacredness. Now, you may say, well, is this really commonplace? Do people, in fact, see the sacred in life in this way? We did a national survey and found that, in fact, a majority of people do endorse these kinds of items, seeing evidence of God in nature, seeing God's presence in all of life. These aren't unusual perceptions. We've done more specific studies and find that in the U.S., a large majority of husbands and wives see their marriages as sacred, see parenting as sacred, see nature as sacred. So this notion of imbuing everyday life with sacred qualities is not weird, it's not unusual. We think it's terribly important. It's a way of bringing heaven to earth and kind of opening up the social scientific study of religion to something larger. Let me just briefly note, how do we come to see the sacred? Well, for some people, it's through direct spiritual encounters. Many people report that they've had a direct experience with God, in which God speaks to them directly, and they're not psychotic. Many people, though, come to the sacred indirectly. For instance, in the Hebrew Bible, we're taught not to look at God directly. Moses couldn't look at God directly because that would kill him. Moses needed to kind of look at God or to God through the corner of his eye. I like that. Peter Berger talks about signals of transcendence. Signals of transcendence. One of my colleagues talks about intimations of the divine. That the divine doesn't hit you over the head. Instead, you have to be alert to signals. I like the way that William Cantwell Smith put it. He kind of captures the same thing. He said that Handel was able to write the Messiah in part because of the faith he had. He says, I have the faith I have in part because Handel wrote the Messiah. So not a direct revelation, but something that hints at the divine core through something in the sacred ring. Now, we learn to see the sacred not only through personal experience, but through our institutions. Every major religious tradition teaches its members to see the sacred, to perceive sacredness in the world. In Hinduism, for instance, we're taught that the things we see are filled with Brahman. In Christianity, we're talked about our gifts as coming from the Spirit. Within Judaism, daily prayers, we're told, holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. So God's presence is filled in the everyday experiences of life. I want to stress then that the sacred can become a yearning for people. It can become the intention, the striving, what people seek in life. People can seek out a relationship with the sacred defined in this broad way. Now keep in mind, remember I'm saying what may be sacred may be not just traditional ideas of God, it may be your work, it may be your marriage, it may be the environment, it can be many things. And that people are motivated to seek that out and form a relationship with things sacred. And without that, the converse side is that without that, then, life may be less significant. Harold Kushner wrote this about a world without God, or you might say a world without the sacred. He argues that a world without the sacred would be a flat, monochromatic world without color or texture. He says marriage would be a matter of biology, not fidelity. Old age would be seen as a time of weakness, not of wisdom. I love this quote. In a world like that, would cast about desperately for any sort of diversion, for any distraction from the emptiness of our lives, and here's the key, because we'd never have learned the magic of making some days and some hours special. Okay. What I want to focus then on this next part of the talk is research we've done to underscore how important it is for people to be searching for the sacred in their lives. We find some important implications for health and well-being. This isn't trivial. Let me state from the outset, too, that when I'm talking about the sacred, I have no direct measure of God. I don't have a Godmatron out there. No direct measure. I don't have a direct measure of the sacred. What I'm talking about here are people reporting their own perceptions of sacredness in their life, sacredness in marriage, in family, and life generally. So we're talking about what Dan Batson said are the footprints left by faith, not the divine itself. I can't speak as a scientist to the ontological reality of God or the sacred. I have my own beliefs, but as a scientist, I have no measure of God. But we can look at the footprints left by faith, and I think that's good enough. I think that's good enough for us. It's about as far as we're going to be able to go with it. So what are the implications of this search for the sacred? The sacred becomes a magnet. It's an object of devotion. We're drawn to the sacred. Psychologist Paul Johnson said, "It's the ultimate thou whom the religious person seeks most of all." That's a very radical kind of idea. This whole thing's pretty radical. I want to underscore that for you, because again, in the social sciences, we tend to see religion and spirituality as motivated by things other than religion and spirituality. We tend to reduce it to something else. And I'm making the very simple suggestion here, along with Gordon Allport, who said something very similar, that in fact, the motivation for religion may have something to do with the sacred, that in and of itself is important and perhaps irreducible. The sacred is a magnet. We can find signs of it even in children. Here's a little quote I came across that I really like. A 6-year-old boy wrote God a letter. "Dear God, how is it in heaven? How is it being the big cheese?" And more recent work in cognitive developmental psychology shows the same thing, that it looks as though children are born with this propensity to seek out something sacred from the earliest years in life. It looks like we're hardwired for that propensity. Some very interesting work by Justin Barrett and colleagues in cognitive developmental type of psychology. It's just fascinating. That's highlighting this capacity that we have. The sacred also becomes a powerful resource for people that they draw on throughout their lives, and often in their most desperate times. Certainly, we can already see it with the reports of how people are coping with the Boston Marathon tragedy. I came across this quote years ago that I thought these quotes that were very interesting. Life magazine, when there was a Life magazine, went out and interviewed survivors of a plane crash. This is a very unusual plane crash in that the tail of this plane in midair blew off, and a number of people were killed. And the plane was then hurtling down to earth in an Iowa cornfield. And it took several minutes for the plane to finally crash. But they survived. Many people survived. So Life magazine went out and interviewed the survivors about what was their experience as the plane was going down. Just imagine that. You've got a couple of minutes, you think you're going to die. What were you thinking? What were you doing? And I took out all of the quotes, and almost every quote had something religious in it. That people in those final minutes were turning to something about faith. One guy was talking about how he noticed a nun across the row from him praying on a rosary, and he remembered, again, the plane is going down. You just have to try to imagine the horror of that. So he's pulling out a cross in his pocket and holding onto it, grasping the cross. A Buddhist said this, and I think this is really cool. He said, "I've done a lot of Buddhist meditation in my life, and this trained me to become one pointed in my awareness," which is an object in Buddhism, to be in the moment, no matter what. And for your last breath, you should be in the moment with your last breath within Buddhist philosophy. So here this guy is trying to be totally focused on the brace position, arms in front of the knees, bent over like that. He's trying to be totally mindful about being in the brace position. But more generally, he's also living by his ultimate philosophy. And virtually everyone going down on this plane was doing that. They were living by their deepest beliefs because it's their resource. Nothing unusual here. We've done a number of studies showing that in times of stress and tragedy, people draw on religious coping methods. They seek spiritual support. They frame the illness or the tragedy in benevolent spiritual terms as maybe God's will or a chance to get closer to God. They may give it over to God and surrender. They seek out help from a religious community. They seek religious forgiveness, and so on, or they give support to others, spiritual support. And these resources are really powerful, empowering resources for people in their darkest times of life. This sacred is a tremendous resource, and we've got this is really well documented. It's also the case, you know what, I think, one other example, I'll show you this study, to make the same point. Amy Wachholtz, one of my former graduate students, was interested in looking at whether spiritual meditation was especially helpful to people with chronic headaches. Now, the meditation literature talks about the importance of meditating, but it also says that what you meditate to, the mantra you meditate to, you want to have something that's meaningful to you, but that's all you need. Amy was asked the question, well, maybe a spiritual mantra would be especially helpful to people versus a more secular mantra. Amy is an MDiv student from Boston University. So she taught people how to meditate with chronic headaches, chronic migraineurs. And the meditation groups were identical except the phrase they meditated to. The spiritual meditators meditated to phrases such as God is peace and God is joy. The secular meditators, again, same meditation, but they meditated to phrases like I'm joyful, grass is green, and then we did a progressive muscle relaxation. We then monitored pain through the cold pressure task. You stick your hands in ice water, it's painful, and frequency of headaches. And what did we find? Look at the solid red line. That's the spiritual meditation group. The spiritual meditators experienced a much sharper decline in the frequency of headaches. In diaries, the same thing. Spiritual meditators, much sharper decline in frequency of headaches. Pain tolerance. How long do you keep your hands in ice water? Spiritual meditators, twice as long. Really interesting finding because we know that people with chronic pain can abuse medication. So the idea that here's a technique that may help reduce pain or help tolerate pain, enhance pain tolerance, has some practical significance here. Again, it looks like the sacred is a really potent type of resource for people. Another implication of the search for the sacred, people who experience sacredness experience powerful emotions. Joy, awe. That's a hummingbird. See, she's holding a hummingbird, or see that? Isn't that cool? Gratitude, love and compassion. I love that picture. You know, I mentioned that African Americans have double the life expectancy benefit by going to church regularly. And that relates to this notion of spiritual emotion. The question is why that might be. And it's a very interesting issue. Why would African Americans experience double the life expectancy benefit? And we really don't have a good answer to it. But my hypothesis is, and we could actually study this, is that African American churches are particularly good at eliciting powerful spiritual emotions of just the kind that I'm talking about here. That overall, African American churches are just really good at facilitating emotional expression, uplift, and awe. If you go to a number of African American churches, you'll feel it. You'll get the feeling, and you compare it to some white churches, you'll see the difference. Very powerful difference. I only semi-jokingly then say there's a warning in this. If powerful spiritual emotions can enhance life expectancy, then boring churches can kill you. Those of you who've been in a boring church may know exactly what I'm talking about here. Another important implication of the search for the sacred as a striving becomes an organizing force. Some of our strivings and goals tend to be higher order, and they kind of define our life by providing our lives with an overarching organizing principle. An overarching organizing principle. And I would say that religions provide that for their members, for people who believe And convert, for instance, conversion experience means your life has been totally changed because you now have a new organizing principle. 12-step programs encourage their members to make a shift in organizing principles, to shift from a life in which they themselves may be their own false gods to a life in which they admit their own powerlessness and to replace their own narcissistic strivings with a higher order striving, some kind of divine striving. Let me give you a clinical example. And I think this really was very striking to me. I worked with a woman who had terrible victim of a trauma. She had been gang raped. And I was seeing her for PTSD, suicidality, and I only learned a little bit later that she also had a dissociative identity disorder, multiple personality. And very challenging, just trying to help her stay alive and to deal with the stress she was under, and to try to see if she could create more wholeness. Really challenging. I'd make some progress with her, and then one of the personas, she had 8 personas. The angry persona would come in after we made some progress and say, "We can't trust you. You're another male. You're trying to deceive us. You're going to trick us. We've got to rely on ourselves, and it's bad that the others are starting to rely on you." Well, that's a conflict. So then there would be backup and resistance. And this went on I've worked with this person for years, until one day the angry persona came in and said, "We've decided we're not coming in anymore. You're just not trustworthy. You're a man. Don't take it personally, but you're a man, and men have only hurt us, and we feel that you're taking away from our strength, so we're not coming back anymore." Well, one of the other personas, who is more depressed persona, said, "No, you can't do that. We have to come back. We have to come back." "No, we're not coming back anymore because he's only taking away from our strength." "No, we have to come back. Nobody else cares about us like he does. Nobody else is going to help." "No, we're not coming back anymore." Back and forth in the session. And I mean, it may sound a little weird, but I was used to, it was kind of like family therapy with one person, back and forth and back and forth. And what I told the family, was that my job was not to try to force them to come back. I said, "I think you need some help, but you've had enough of men coercing you in your life, and I'm not going to be part of that. So if you want to come back, I'm happy to see you. If you'd like a referral, I'm happy to refer you to someone else. But it's your call whether you want to be here." "No, you have to convince us to come back. It's no good." So this went back on and off. And I said, "Well, look, I'm going to be here next week. If you come back, it's your call. I hope you come back, but it's your decision." I was really nervous. I mean, this is a suicidal woman. She needed to be in treatment. Well, the next week she came in. Whew, quite a relief. And she came in, and I got to meet the last persona. The last persona spoke quietly, and she said, "I'd like to introduce myself." And she gave a name. "I'm Betsy. And I found something in scriptures that I want to read to all of you." Now, this client had never been talked about religion or spirituality at all. It was just not on the map. She's coming in now quoting scriptures. And here's what she quoted. She read this to the other personas. "If the foot shall say, because I'm not the hand, I'm not of the body, it's therefore not of the body. If the whole body were an eye, where were the hearing? If the whole were hearing, where were the smelling? But now are they many members, yet but one body. And the eye cannot say unto the hand, I have no need of thee, nor again the head to the feet, I have no need of you. Nay, much more those members of the body, which seem to be more feeble, are necessary." Whoa. She stopped everyone with that. And what is this all about? Well, I'm no expert on the New Testament or Corinthians, but I just thought this had to be a speech that was given to people with multiple personality disorder. But I'm just joking. But it's something that's very useful for people with dissociative identity, because it says we need to work together. We're all parts of the whole, and we can't fragment. And so interesting, because her spiritual persona was the voice for integration. Her spiritual persona was the voice for wholeness. And that's what I'm saying. Sacredness tends to be the overarching organizing principle. And she came in and kind of saved the day with her holistic presentation here. And she continues to be a force for wholeness and integration. And that's what spirituality is about. Let me move forward here to get to some other points I want to make. I want to note that there can be problems in the search for the sacred. And problems can arise when the sacred is lost, threatened, or violated. So there are wonderful benefits to pursuing sacredness in life. One of the downsides is when you lose something sacred. Losing something sacred is especially painful. Feeling that someone has violated something sacred, that's especially dangerous. If you feel someone has willfully violated what you hold sacred, there are some consequences of that. 9/11. We did some studies after 9/11 and found that college students who perceived 9/11 as a sacred violation, a violation of their deepest sacred values, experienced far more distress. And interestingly, this is the important point here, they are more likely to support extremist reactions, such as dropping nuclear bombs on the countries that host terrorists, using biological weapons on the countries that host terrorists. If you feel like your sacred values are being desecrated, it seems to create kind of a permission to do extreme responses. You'll do anything to protect what's sacred. Very, very challenging kind of implication. There's also problems that arise when your understanding of the sacred becomes small or constricted, so that your understanding of the sacred is narrow and applies only to your particular religious group. So you may have wonderful benevolent implications of holding things sacred, and you may love other people who hold things sacred as long as they hold sacred what you hold sacred. But if they're not part of your sacred group, again, then there may be real problems there. Problems arise when people may attach sacred value to false gods, such as narcissism. The Beltway shooter, the Beltway sniper in D.C. several years ago, wrote this letter, "Dear policeman, I am God." So that's a kind of, narcissism, false god. And there are many false gods in our culture: materialism, narcissism, alcoholism, drugs, all can be false gods. So all of this, and then to note too, that problems arise when people have conflicting views of what's sacred. When people say, this is sacred to me, what you hold sacred isn't sacred to me, therefore I can do what I want with what you hold sacred because it's not really, really sacred. And then we end up stepping on each other's sacred toes. And again, that becomes potential fuel for incredibly explosive reactions, as we've seen in the Mideast. So what are some implications for this? Well, first of all, my basic conclusion is that sacred matters matter. Sacred matters really matter, and that our yearning for the sacred is a distinctive human motivation, and we better take it seriously and not try to explain it away as something purely biological, social, or psychological. If we don't appreciate the yearning for the sacred as a human yearning in and of itself, I don't think we're going to be able to understand people completely or solve the incredibly complex personal, social, political, international problems that plague us today. We're just beginning to learn about it and to look at some practical implications. Let me give you a few examples briefly of some practical implications. One is encouraging people to make the sacred more explicit, to help people learn how to make what's sacred to them more explicit in their lives. We developed a program at Boston University. We called it Sacred Gifts, and it's for people with social anxiety disorder. And we tried, with social anxiety disorder, people see their anxiety as the overriding guiding force in their lives to avoid anxious situations. That guides their lives. And we use this figure ground illusion to make the point that with social anxiety disorder, all people see is the vase. That's all there is, the vase. Do you see something else here? Do you see the two figures profiles? There's a figure, but there's a ground. When people see the sacred, making it more explicit helps people see a deeper dimension to their lives, which can be extraordinarily helpful to people. In this intervention with people with social anxiety disorder, we tried to teach them to see a deeper dimension to their lives. So we taught them to try to see sacredness in the environment, and we had these slides to help them do it, nature, animals. We had one with children. We went on with it. And the sessions were quite helpful to people. You can see in the solid line the anxiety before and after each session. We made some dramatic changes in social anxiety, and then the sense of sacredness in these sessions also generally increased. So it was really very interesting. By making the sacred more explicit, it was helpful to people to be able to see their lives in a new perspective. I'll give you an example, another cabbie example. This is a more positive cabbie example. We were interviewing all the participants, and this Boston cabbie, kind of a crusty guy, we asked him, well, how did the program affect you, Sacred Gifts? And he says in his Boston accent, well, I don't know what you call it. I don't know if you call it the sacred stuff, whatever you call it, but let me tell you something that happened to me the other day. He said, I'm sitting at the light, and it's another one of these damn days in Boston, you know? And I'm sitting there, and traffic's terrible, and I'm thinking, God, how long before I have to leave here? And then I see this old lady walking across the street, and she stops in front of my cab, and she looks at me, and she gives me a smile. Now, I didn't know this lady from Adam. Why the hell did she give me a smile? She didn't have to do that, but she did it. And you know, it stuck with me. I still think about it. Call it sacred, call it what you want. It stuck with me. Okay. All right, that's the kind of change that we were able to, I think, encourage through this program. The last thing I want to mention as an intervention is just the importance nowadays of affirming different ways to see and understand the sacred. This is really challenging. How do we help people develop respect for alternate views of the sacred? I'll end with this example, and it's one of the most helpful books I've read in a long time. It's called At the Entrance of the Garden of Eden, and it's by Yossi Klein Halevi. Now, he's an Orthodox Jewish Israeli journalist, and he was trying to figure out some way to promote understanding among Jews, Christians, and Muslims in Jerusalem. He initially started by trying to have a dialogue, by talking about religion, talking about politics, and it went nowhere. Any conversation just descended into vitriol, into terrible conflict, terrible fighting. He got very upset with the whole thing, and he was about to give it all up, deciding that you can't get beyond polemics, blame, and recrimination in Israel. Well, he did something different, which I think is really kind of exciting. What he did was he started going to the prayer services of people from different traditions. So he started to go to the prayer services of Christians. He went to a Sufi service in which he watched and in part engaged in prayerful dancing with the Muslim Sufis. Now, he didn't go as a Christian or as a Muslim. He didn't convert. He went as a Jew who was being respectful and interested in being taught about other traditions. And somehow, he said, his willingness to participate in their sacredness, to understand it and participate in it, was the step that broke the impasse. They began to talk. They talked about their common yearning for something sacred in their lives. And so his lesson was one of hope, and this is how he concluded it. He said, the one enduring transformation that he carries with him is that he learned to venerate, to love Christianity and Islam. He learned to feel, this Orthodox Jew, learned to feel at home in a church, even on a Good Friday, and in a mosque, even in Gaza. The cross and the minaret had become for me cherished symbols of God's presence. And here's the kicker, reminders that he speaks to us in multiple language, that he speaks to us at all. So, this is a new and exciting area. We don't have to whisper anymore. You haven't heard me whisper at all today, but we need to know a lot more. We can't afford to neglect the spiritual, the sacred itself when we're asking, why are people religious? It's our yearning for the sacred. Our yearning for the sacred may be at least part of what makes us healthy, human, and whole. Thank you. Time for a few questions. What do you think? Yeah, a couple of questions? Comments, questions, reactions? Yes?
In defining the sacred, have you looked at all at the idea of catharsis? You're talking about standing at the precipice of the Grand Canyon. Is there any crossover with the notion of catharsis?
Do you say catharsis?
Catharsis.
Yeah, I think part of one of the things that we're looking at right now, we're calling them sacred moments, in which we're very interested in looking at sacredness in relationships through periods of deep connectedness between people. What Buber would call I-thou relationships, or what in Christian terms might be called union kinds of connections, which involve some catharsis. But it's interesting, it's not just, when we talk about sacred moments in that sense, it's not just the client opening up, it's the listener or the helper also opens up. So there is a kind of soul-soul connection. We've been doing research on that, and we're finding that these sacred moments in helping healing relationships are predictors of meaning in work by providers, satisfaction with work, and predictors of change and growth in relationships. So that's as close as we come to it, but I think you're onto something there. Yeah. Yeah. Yes?
As I was listening to your point about helping people make their sacred more explicit, even though you were speaking at the individual level, but one thing that came to my mind was more societal potential application, which is related to the constant and actually in recent years increasing conflict between atheists and various religious groups, and especially Christian groups, and their efforts was to get rid of any symbol, any explicit expression. I don't know whether you had one of those as a potential application, or I wonder what you think. Even your point can be extended to such a societal level.
Yeah.
By saying that is not good for this reason, perhaps.
Yeah. Well, at the societal level, this leads to the interesting question of what do we hold sacred in our culture? And it's not just what we say we hold sacred, it's like in terms of what we're making sacred in our culture through the media, through our models, what are we in fact holding up as sacred? And I'd say we got some problems there. The other advantage, I'd say, of this sacred language is it opens the door to myriad sacred possibilities and the possibility that atheists hold things sacred too. Matter of fact, I've been collecting wonderful quotes from atheists who clearly are using the language of transcendence, boundlessness, and ultimacy, and they're die-hard atheists. A recent study done in Sweden of cancer, women with cancer, if you look at their quotes about what gives them meaning in life, for many of them it's nature. And when they talk about nature, nature is just filled with all kinds of sacred qualities. Now, they don't use God language, but they do use sacred language. So in some ways, I think broadening the conversation beyond God to sacredness creates some interesting possibilities for dialogue and sharing among people who may hold different understandings of the sacred, but I think relatively few people hold nothing sacred. Anything else? Okay, well, thank you very much. Enjoyed talking with you.